أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على ثم الصلاة والسلام على آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من يوم عداوتهم إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتابه: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فليضحكوا قليلا وليبكوا كثيرا جزاء بما كانوا يكسبون. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. This is our second gathering in Majlis in search of a weeping heart. And last night we began by narrating a lengthy riwayah, which we said will be the inspiration for the rest of our discussion. And many of you did request that we complete the riwayah, so we will, inshallah. And I'm glad that many of you did show up today as well. I wasn't very hopeful, but if you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. When I reviewed what was left from the riwayah, I found that there were other points as well that are relevant to our discussion. So inshallah, it is not just a question of completing the discussion, but we will find material here as well that will supplement our discussion on searching for a weeping heart. Last night we saw that Jibreel alayhi salam describes the gates of hell and the forms of punishment therein. And the Messenger of Allah, peace be on him and his family, is extremely grieved by the fact that people from his ummah will also be subjected to this fire. And he shuts himself away from the public until his daughter is able to break that silence and approach him and then ask him, and he now begins narrating to her. So we stopped at a point where the archangel who oversees the gates of Jahannam, who is known as Malik, is at the gate of Jahannam, and these Muslims who have committed sins and crimes for which they did not repent have been brought to him. فإذا وقف بهم على شفير جهنم ونظروا إلى النار وإلى زبانيا فقالوا يا مالك إئذن لنا نبكي على أنفسنا. So when they are brought to the brink of hellfire, and they see that the angels of punishment, the Zabaniya, are waiting for them, they will say, "O Malik, give us some time so that we may cry over ourselves." فَيَبْكُونَ الدُّمُوعَ حَتَّى لَا يَبْقَ لَهُمُ الدُّمُوعُ فَيَبْكُونَ الدَّمَ. So they will shed tears and cry until no tears are left in them, and then they will cry blood. فَيَقُولُ مَالِكٌ ما أحسن هذا لو كان في الدنيا فلو كان هذا البكاء في الدنيا من خشية الله تعالى ما مسكم النار اليوم. And Malik will say to them, how excellent, how good these tears would have been if you would have shed them in the world. For if you would have wept out of the fear of God in the world, then the fire would not have touched you this day. فيقول مالك للزبانية ألقوهم في النار. Malik will then say to those angels waiting for them, the angels of punishment, take them into the fire. فَنَادَوْا بِأَجْمَعِهِمْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ فَتُرْجِعُ عَنْهُمُ النَّارِ. So the fire will also come forward to grasp them, and they will begin calling out in unison, لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ, and the fire will retract. فَيَقُولُ مَالِكْ يَا نَارُ خُذِيهِمْ. And Malik will say to the fire, "O fire, grab them, take them." فَتَقُولُ النَّارُ وَكَيْفَ آخِذُهُمْ وَهُمْ يَقُولُونَ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. And the fire shall say, O Malik, how can we take one who is saying there is no God but Allah? فَيَقُولُ مَالِكْ نَعَمْ بِذَلِكَ أَمَرَ رَبُّ الْعَرْشِ. But Malik will insist and say, indeed you must grab them and take them, because this is what the Lord of the throne has commanded. فَتَأْخُذُهُمْ فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ تَأْخُذُهُ إِلَى قَدَمَيْهِ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ تَأْخُذُهُ إِلَى رَكْبَتَيْهِ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ تَأْخُذُهُ إِلَى حَقْوَيْهِ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ تَأْخُذُهُ إِلَى حَلْقِهِ. So the fire will come forward and grab them. Some of them, it will grab them until their feet. Some of them will be grabbed until their knees. Some of them will be grabbed until their waist. And some of them will be grabbed until their necks. When the fire comes towards their face, Malik will say, لا تحرقي وجوههم فطالما سجدوا للرحمن في الدنيا. Do not burn their faces, for these are the faces that spent a lot of time prostrating before the merciful Lord in the world. ولا تحرقي قلوبهم فطالما عطشوا في شهر رمضان. And do not burn their hearts as well. This connects to our topic, as we shall see. And do not burn their hearts as well, because of the thirst and the fasting of theirs in the month of Ramadan. فَيَبْقُونَ مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ فِيهَا فَيُنَادَوْنَ يَا رَحْمَانُ يَا أَرْحَمَ الرَّاحِمِينَ يَا حَنَّانُ يَا مَنَّانُ. So they shall remain in there for as long as God pleases, and whilst they remain in there, they shall be calling out, O most merciful of the most merciful ones, O compassionate, O gracious one, Ya Hannanu, Ya Mannan. Now remember, when you read the other ahadith about the fire of hell, you will find that the people who are sent into the fire of hell, initially they will be given the ability to have some conversation. For example, in the Quran we are told that at one point they will ask Malik to pour a little bit of water to them. Or at some point they will ask Allah, give us a second chance so that we may go back. But at one point Allah says to them, be quiet and do not talk to me anymore. And thereafter we are told their power of speech will be taken away from them. And the only thing that will come from them is sighing and groaning and moaning and making sounds like animals and braying like donkeys. This is for the people of hell. But these who are Muslims, they shall be left with their power of speech, and they shall continue calling out, Ya Hannanu, Ya Mannan. So when Allah has decreed and passed His judgment, He shall say, Ya Jibra'il, ma fa'ala al-'asuna min ummati Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He shall say, O Jibra'il, what has happened to the sinners from the ummah of Muhammad? And Jibreel shall say, Ilahi anta a'lamu bihim. My Lord, you know better than I do. He shall say, go and see what their condition is. So Jibreel shall come to Malik. Now Malik is created of he is made such that the fire does not burn him. And nor does it torment him. So when Jibreel comes to Malik, وَهُوَ عَلَى سَرِيرٍ مِّن نَارٍ فِي وَسَطِ جَهَنَّمٍ, he shall be reclining on a bed of fire in the middle of Jahannam. فَإِذَا نَظَرَ مَالِكْ إِلَى جِبْرَائِيلَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ قَامَ تَعْظِيمًا لَهُ. When Malik sees Jibreel coming, he shall stand out of honor and respect for him. He shall say to him, O Jibreel, what causes you to enter in a place like this? He shall say, what has happened to the sinners from the ummah of Muhammad? Malik shall say, how wretched is their condition, and how confined is their space. The fire has burnt their bodies and eaten up their flesh. Nothing is left of them except their faces and their hearts, which continue to shimmer and shine with faith. In other words, they have been purged of all their sins to a point where now there is only faith left that is still in their hearts and in their faces. فَيَقُولُ جِبْرَائِيلُ إِرْفَعُ الطَّبَقَ عَنْهُمْ حَتَّى أَنْظُرُوا إِلَيْهِمْ. He shall say to Malik, lift the lid of Jahannam and let me see what their condition is in this furnace. قال ويأمر مالك الخزانة فيرفعون الطبق. Malik shall command those who are in charge, and they shall lift the lid. When Jibreel sees them, and they see the beauty and the handsome face of Jibreel, they will know that he is not one of the angels of punishment. They shall say, who is this in our midst who is so handsome and beautiful in his face? And Malik shall say, هذا جبرائيل الكريم على الله تعالى الذي كان يأتي محمدا بالوحي. This is Jibreel, the messenger, the archangel of God, who used to go to Muhammad with revelation. When they hear the name of Muhammad again, they shall begin calling out and saying, O Jibreel, اقرأ محمدا منا السلام وأخبره أن معاصينا فرقت بيننا وبينك وأخبره بسوء حالنا. Give our salams to Muhammad and tell him our sins have separated us from you, and how wretched is our condition. So Jibreel shall return to Allah, and Allah shall say to him, how did you find the ummah of Muhammad? He shall say, my Lord, wretched is their condition and confined is their space. He shall say to Jibreel, did they ask you anything? He will say, Na'am ya Rabbi, they asked me to give their salam to the Prophet and to let the Prophet know of their condition. And Allah shall say to him, go then and inform the Prophet. Now the narration says that Jibreel alayhi salam shall come to where the Prophet will be, and he shall be in a tent that is made and constructed out of white pearls. It shall have 4,000 doors with handles on its flaps that are made of gold. He will come into that place and say, Ya Muhammad, ji'tuka min indil al-usat min ummatika yu'adhibuna bin nar. O Muhammad, I have come to you after meeting the sinners from your ummah. They give you salams and they say to you, how wretched is our condition. So the messenger of Allah shall come to the arsh, to where the throne of Allah is. فَيَخِرُّ سَاجِدًا. He will fall down in prostration before Allah, and he will praise Allah in a manner and with words that no one has ever praised Allah, and with words that nobody has ever used to praise Allah. And Allah shall then Azza wa Jal say to him, raise your head and ask me for whatever you want, and intercede for whoever you wish this day. He shall say, Ya Rabbi al-ashqiya min ummati. My Lord, you have passed your decree. I now intercede for the wretched amongst my ummah. And Allah shall say to them, I have accepted your intercession. Go and take forth whoever you want from amongst them, who testifies that there is no God but Allah. And the Prophet shall come to the gates of Jahannam. When Malik sees the Prophet, he will stand out of honor and respect for him, and he will say to Malik, O Malik, where are my people? And Malik shall say, your people are in the most wretched of conditions. The Prophet shall say to Malik, open the door, O Malik, and raise the lid. When the people of the fire of hell see him, they shall call out in unison and say, the fire has burnt our skin, and it has burnt our livers. And the messenger of God shall take them all out one by one from the fire of hell. They shall become burnt and crisp like a coal, a piece of coal that has become burnt. And the fire shall have eaten them completely. They will be brought to a gate of paradise where a river flows, and the river shall be called Al-Hayawan. So this is very symbolic as well. Al-Hayawan is that which gives life. And they shall be then asked to immerse themselves in this river called Al-Hayawan. And when they enter this river and come forth from it, they shall all change into young, handsome youths who look like their eyes have got kuhul on them, mukahhilin. وُجُوهُهُمْ مِثْلَ الْقَمَرِ مَكْتُوبَ عَلَى جِبَاهِهِمْ. Their faces shall become radiant like the full moon, and on their forehead shall be inscribed, جَهَنَّمِيُّونَ أُتَقَاءُ الرَّحْمَنِ مِنَ النَّارِ. These are the people of Jahannam who have been freed from the fire of hell by the merciful Lord. And in this manner they shall be entered into paradise. When the people of hell who are left behind see that all the Muslims have now left from the fire of hell, they shall say and express remorse, Ya laytana kunna muslimin. Alas for us, if only we had been Muslims. Wa kunna nakhruju minan nar. And we too would have been coming out of the fire this day. Wa huwa qawluhu ta'ala. And this is the interpretation of the verse of the Quran which says, رُبَّمَا يَوَدُّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَوْ كَانُوا مُسْلِمِينَ. Often shall those who disbelieve wish that they had become Muslims. And this then brings us to the end of the riwayah. Now, Mullah Faid Kashani, of course, puts a footnote to this to explain this. He says, I am aware that this lengthy riwayah appears to contradict a very popular hadith as well that says, لا يؤذب أهل التوحيد بالنار. That the fire of hell shall never touch those who testify to the oneness of God. Those who do not commit shirk shall never burn in the fire of hell. And he then tries to explain how this riwayah falls in. For example, we have in some traditions that for those who believe in Allah and those who seek to succeed in the hereafter, when they make mistakes in this world, Allah attempts to first erase their sins by giving them suffering or difficulties in this life. If their sins are still more than that and they have not repented, then Allah makes their death difficult. If their sins are still more than that and they have not repented, then Allah gives them some form of punishment in the grave so that they may be purified. But if barzakh does not purify them as well, then as a last resort, there are a few Muslims who would have to be exposed to the fire of hell. Whereas for those who turn to Allah in sin and in transgression and disobey and rebel and commit injustice against others, and they harm and do dhulm on other human beings as well, for them it is the opposite, that if they have done any good, Allah pays them back in this world. And if they have done more good, then Allah makes their death easy for them. And if they still have some good left, then He makes their time in the grave easy. So that when they rise on the Day of Judgment, they have nothing left to claim from Allah. So there is that whole explanation. But Mullah Faid Kashani then as well goes on to say that it is possible that the Muslims who are subjugated to this may not include the Shia of Ali Muhammad. And he then has his own arguments and his own proofs to explain why the Shia of Ali Muhammad may not be included in this. But for our purpose, as we have been narrating since yesterday, there are certain points that we want to bring out of these riwayah. One is the idea that in Islam, the concept of weeping is very highly encouraged. And the general message you will find from Quran and Hadith is that those who weep in this world out of the fear of Allah or out of the love of Allah, they shall rejoice and laugh on the Day of Judgment. And the Quran actually describes this very graphically, that there are believers in this world when the hypocrites and when their enemies pass by them, they tease them, they make fun of them, they wink at each other. But on the Day of Judgment, it is the believers who shall sit reclining on thrones laughing amongst themselves. So there is a contrast to that. And those who rejoice in the materialism and in the life of this world, and they take their share here, وَمَنْ يُرِيدْ ثَوَابَ الدُّنْيَا نُؤْتِهِ مِنْهَا وَمَنْ يُرِيدْ ثَوَابَ الْآخِرَةِ نُؤْتِهِ مِنْهَا. Those who want the reward of this world, we give them their share in this world. And those who want in the hereafter, we give them in the hereafter. There is something I sometimes say not in a public forum, but I should mention it here. But understand the intention with which I'm saying it. There is a formula and a recipe that a person can be given by which I can guarantee you that the life of your worldly life will prosper if you're willing to give up your hereafter. And this is based on this ayah of Quran from Surah Ali Imran, verse 145, where Allah says, whosoever wants the life of this world, we shall give him. وَمَنْ يُرِيدْ ثَوَابَ الدُّنْيَا نُؤْتِهِ مِنْهَا وَمَنْ يُرِيدْ ثَوَابَ الْآخِرَةِ نُؤْتِهِ مِنْهَا. The choice is in our hands. Now here is the recipe that I will share with you. If a person has been pious up until now in their life, and they decide that they don't mind suffering in the fire of hell for eternity, but they don't want to suffer in this world anymore. All they have to do is just pray 2 rakats and then say to Allah, "Oh Allah, I give up my hereafter. I don't want anymore. Pay me back for all the good I have done until this day in this world." Remember, I'm not telling you to do it, so I'm not accountable for it. I'm just showing you that sometimes when life is very difficult, sometimes when we suffer and we say, "Why did somebody I love pass away?" Or "Why has Allah done this to me?" Or "Why have I been suffering from an illness that others are not?" Or "Why am I poor?" It is because we don't understand that Allah has accumulated for us in the hereafter in exchange for this. But if you seriously want to take this world in exchange for the hereafter, and if you decree that the price of your soul is not worth Jannah, it is the worth of this world only, you can exchange it. Because the Quran is saying, whosoever wants this world, we will give him. So Allah will not break His promise. All you have to do is say to Allah, "I want this world, pay me back." Iblis, when Allah said to him, "Get out from here," he asked to be paid for all his ibadat. And Allah did not turn him down. He said, "I want life until the day of judgment." And Allah says, "I give you life until an appointed time." So if Allah does not turn Iblis away for whatever worth his worship was, even though his worship may not have been as sincere, that is why he became Iblis, why would Allah not give you your share? But are you willing to give that up? Say to Allah, "I do not want Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. I do not want Jannah. I am willing to burn forever, but I don't want to suffer in this world." And I guarantee you, you will see how your life will change. You will be rich, you will prosper. You will sit at home and money will come to you. But that will be an evil price to pay. وَمَنْ يُرِيدْ ثَوَابَ الْآخِرَةِ. And if you want akhirah, then your focus has to be different. Then you must be willing to take some suffering in this world in exchange for that. In any case, we move on from that to our discussion, which is In Search of a Weeping Heart. Last night we also mentioned a hadith from Uddatul Da'i, which says, بَيْنَ الْجَنَّةِ وَالنَّارِ أَقَبَ لَا يَجُوزُهَا إِلَّا الْبَكَّاؤُونَ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ. Between paradise and hell, there is a steep incline. None shall be able to cross this except those who weep out of the fear of Allah. So we have this task ahead of us, that before we die, we must change our inner condition to a point where we are able to cry when we pray to Allah, whether it is out of fear or awe or love. There are some faiths that say Islam teaches an unjust or a mighty punishing God, whereas we teach a God of love. But Allah is the master, and the sign of wisdom is to start with awe and fear of Allah. So whether we cry out of love for Him, which is a higher level of spirituality, or whether we cry out of awe for Him. When we look at the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, we see that they used to shiver when it was time for salat. They used to become pale. They used to cry. They used to weep. When they went for Hajj, one of their most difficult tasks was to say, Labbaik, Allahumma Labbaik. And people would come to them and say, Yabna Rasulullah, you have to say Labbaik. And they would be shivering and crying. And they would say, I'm afraid, what if I say Labbaik and I hear a voice saying, La Labbaik? I do not want you here. So they are teaching us that they're not pretending this. Some people will say they're pretending to teach us. That would be hypocrisy, na'udhu billah. That is a true inner condition that they're asking us to become like or to follow or to model after them. And how do we get to that? So we mentioned yesterday that crying or laughing in itself may be just a noise that we make that has no meaning. But in reality, it is an indicator. It is a way of measuring somebody's inner state. Thereafter, we said there is one type of crying and laughing which is shallow and hollow. Like sometimes somebody might say something, or you might say something, and somebody might laugh. And you know they're not really laughing, but they're just being polite because they don't want to offend you. So that laugh would be a hollow laugh. Or somebody might cry, but you might say this is crocodile tears, because that isn't sincere crying. And then there is a level of crying which is profound, where a person cries from the heart, where we say his heart is bleeding, or he died out of grief, Or somebody laughs as well, but deeply from within, and we say it was a hearty laugh. So we begin seeing that when something comes from the heart, it is true and genuine. And therefore, if a person learns to weep from the heart, the tears that come after that is much more sincere and meaningful. And that is the kind of weeping that we want in this world, so that we don't weep in the hereafter. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now you also see that these Muslims in this riwayah, they did not weep in this world as Malik tells them. But at what point did they start crying? If you listen to the narration, it says, when they saw the fire of hell, then they began crying. So we see that one of the reasons that they were not crying was also because of the lack of conviction, the lack of that yaqeen about the fire of hell. If they had that level of conviction in this world that they now have at the brink of hellfire, then there was no reason for them not to cry in this world. And so, by trying to change our inner condition, or by trying to soften our hearts, or by trying to bring ourselves to that point, that even when we are sitting alone in the middle of the night on our prayer mat, we are able to bring that feeling that makes us cry, we are also trying to increase our conviction and our yaqeen. And we shall talk about this a little more in the later nights as we talk about what are the things that soften the heart and harden the heart, inshallah. For tonight and for tomorrow, I need to discuss a little bit about the heart now. A bit from an Islamic point of view and a little bit from a psychological and scientific point of view. It is important because unless we understand how Islam and how science describes the function and the role of the heart, we will not appreciate fully the value of the heart and the importance of connecting this weeping and the heart. So it may appear tonight and tomorrow that I'm talking only about the heart, but I will connect it to the weeping, inshallah, in due course. There are three important parts to this discussion that I want to talk about, inshallah, and we'll try and do one tonight, inshallah. The first thing is, what is the relationship between our minds and our hearts? The second thing is, what is the connection between our physical heart and our spiritual heart? And you will be amazed when we start talking about this. I'm talking about the organ in our chest that pumps blood, the physical heart. What is its connection with this spiritual heart that we talk about? There is a solid connection between the two. The third thing that we want to talk about is the importance of the heart, not as the most important organ in our body or in our spiritual life, but really as our essence and our being and who we really are. But let's start with the first discussion, which is the relationship between the mind and the heart. Islam is of the opinion that the most important part of a human being is the heart and not the mind. And Islam has been saying this for the last 1400 years. Science, on the other hand, has been arguing that the most important part of a human being is his mind or the brain. And science argues that a man is only truly dead when he is brain dead. And once the cells of the brain die, then the man is gone. Islam, on the other hand, has been arguing that the real organ that understands, that comprehends, that realizes, that ponders, that reflects, that has a meaningful understanding of anything is the heart and not the mind. So up until now, people might have argued, or up until a few centuries ago maybe, that Islam came 1400 years ago. The people in those days did not understand how the human system worked or how the human mind worked and so on and so forth, and science had not progressed. So it's all symbolic, or the heart is just the soul that Islam is talking about, but in reality it's all happening in the mind. Now, however, science is changing its tone. One of the things that I say time and time again is that yes, we should use science to our benefit where we can, and science as it progresses, it will only prove Islam right. But one of the things we need to understand is that science is very primitive compared to Islam. And this is something we need to understand. The Quran is far, far more scientific and advanced than science as we understand it. But science is primitive. It is learning, it is growing, and as it does, it will come to this realization. For example, When the Quran talks about reflecting, it says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Do they not ponder on the Quran? Do they not reflect on the Quran? Or are there locks on their hearts? You see, scientifically it doesn't make sense, because scientifically the Quran should have said, do they not ponder on the Quran, or are there locks on their minds? But the Quran is saying, or are there locks on their hearts, as if the heart is the one that does tadabbur. فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٍ فَزَادَهُمُ اللَّهُ مَرَضٍ. The reason why they don't accept the truth is because in their hearts there is a disease. And Allah allows that disease to increase because of their turning away from Allah. كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. Nay, it is because of the rust that has covered their hearts because of what they did or what they earned. So we see time and time again, if you read the Quran, you will see that the Quran is of the opinion that the organ that really understands or realizes is not the mind, it is the heart. Now, the other thing that I have mentioned also in the past is that the heart will never deceive you. It will always be true to you, whereas the mind might deceive you. You could fall sick and lose your mind. You could go through a phase where your mind is not in control. You could temporarily become insane, but you will not lose your heart. And in the past, when I've spoken on this subject, I have given you an example of a compass and a map. Some of you might recall this. And I said, the heart is like a compass, whereas the mind is like a map. A map will show me this is north, but I have to be facing north for that to be true. And as I move around with the map, the north on the map changes. But a compass has a needle that always points back to north. In whatever direction I turn, the compass will always point to its true point of origin. In the same way, the heart will always point to Allah. The mind may not point to Allah, depending on the argument somebody gives you. Somebody may have more intelligence than you. Somebody may have a very powerful theological argument that might confuse you. It will not always point to Allah. You can get 70 reasons to prove Allah exists, and then your mind will produce another 70 reasons to prove He doesn't exist, and then another 70 to prove it exists. But the heart, if it is in the right place and purified, it will never lie. It will always point to Allah. Another example of this, or another analogy to this, would be that of a torch and your eyes. If you are looking for something you have lost, and it is dark, and you don't know where to find it, you will need your eyes, and you will need a source of light, like a torch. These two may be compared as, again, your heart and your eyes, where, your heart and your mind, where your heart is like your eyes, and your mind is like the torch. Meaning your mind is a tool that you can use to acquire knowledge, to acquire an understanding, to point you in the right direction. It makes it a lot easier if you have a torch when it is dark. But supposing I was to ask you a question and say, you can't have both. Either you have a torch but no eyes, or have eyes but no torch. What will you take? Eyes. What is the point of having a torch if you're blind? It's not going to do you any good. At least if you have eyes but no torch, groping in the dark, there is a shot in the dark, pun unintended, that you might find what you have lost. So your heart is like your eyes, whereas your torch is like your mind. It is a tool you use. In other words, you can afford to lose knowledge or to take less knowledge, but you cannot afford to corrupt your heart. That is your most precious possession. And in fact, a couple of days back at the Jaffer Islamic Center, one of the young youths there asked me, I was talking about Sheikh Rajab Ali Khayyat, and he says, I've heard Sheikh Rajab Ali Khayyat was not educated, and he wasn't an alim, and he followed the path of zuhud, and is it right, and is it better to be an alim but not spiritual, or is it better to be spiritual but not an alim? Of course, it is better to be an alim and spiritual. Why choose one? But if you had to choose one, the choice is to be spiritual first. Because if one loses their heart, then the knowledge is of no good. You can have an alim who is corrupt. He will not make it to paradise. But you could have a simpleton. He could be just anybody, a farmer, a baker, anybody. But he might make it to Jannah with a pure heart. Lots of examples like this. So our most precious possession is our heart and not our minds. We're not saying the mind has no use. It is a tool, it has a use, it has a function. But it is not more important than the heart. Now, having said this, I came across a book that I want to share with you. It is written by a doctor called Paul Pearsall, and the book is called The Heart's Code. He himself is a practicing doctor, a psychologist, if I can remember correctly, a psychoneuroimmunologist for the last 30 years, and he resides in the US. And he has done some tremendous research on the connection between the mind and the heart. And this book is widely available, and I've borrowed it from the library. So if you're looking to borrow from the library right now, it's not available. It's with me. But some fascinating material in here that I thought would be very appropriate to share with you. And I'll share some tonight and some tomorrow, inshallah. But he talks from a doctor in a scientific point of view, where the idea of a soul or a spirit is not acknowledged. But he now says, instead of talking about a connection between mind, body, and spirit, he's talking about mind, body, and the heart. He's talking about the physical heart. And he says there is an amazing connection, and we have all along been looking at the wrong place. It is not all about the mind. It is all about the heart. This is his argument. He starts off, of course, in some places just by talking about the language that human beings use. He says at a deeper subconscious level, there are things we know, but we just don't realize. For example, when we talk amongst ourselves, we say things like, he has a good heart. Or if he's bad, we say he is hard-hearted. Or he is cold-hearted. We never say he's cold-brained. Or he has a good brain. Right? Why? Or when we really change our mind about something, we say, I've had a change of heart. When I'm very sad, or somebody's very sad, we say, he said this with a heavy heart. Or when it's not very deeply ingrained in me, I say, it was said lightheartedly. So what is the secret to this? He said, I did some psychological experiments, and I went around the world looking at people from different cultures, different backgrounds, who spoke different languages as well. Whenever I said to them, identify yourself, I put a person in front of me and I say, identify yourself. What they do instinctively when they say I is they point towards their chest. He says, I did not find any human being from any culture or any language or any background who pointed to his brain and said, I. Whenever you ask a human being, identify yourself, when he says me or I, he'll point to his chest. Meaning what? Meaning that even the brain, despite all its cleverness and all its intelligence and the high IQ, it knows that the real self is not the brain. And he gives more arguments of this. He says he also found that when people receive very good news or very bad news, they place one or both their hands on their heart. Okay. He says human beings, when they express love for each other, they say, I love you with all my heart. They don't say, I love you with all my brain. Or I wish to give you all my brain. And if you don't believe me, he says, next Valentine Day, he says, send your wife some candy that are brain-shaped. But then don't come to me for marriage counseling. Why do you give your wife candy that is heart-shaped? Because that is where the truth lies. That is your essence. That is your reality. There is an acknowledgement that is very subtle, but we know it. We just don't say it. We just don't realize it. And he says, whenever human beings make very, very, very important decisions in life, they use their heart and not their mind. Because the mind is just a tool. Ask yourself, when you made all the important decisions in life, when you made your decision who you wanted to marry, for example, you might think it was a very mathematical or logical or mental exercise. It was actually a decision of the heart, wasn't it? Even when you purchased your house, you might think you were very smart and wise and you checked economics and the market price and all this. But the ultimate decision, what made you look at the layout and say, this is what I want, it was your heart that decided. Your mind will decide trivial things, like when you're driving on the road, there's a car besides me, let me not move into this lane, or the lights turned green, I'll turn right or left, these little things, it's a tool. But any meaningful decision you make in your life, you will always use your heart. And he says, we have misunderstood the role of the heart. Now, because he is looking at it from a cardiological point of view as well, he comes up with some very interesting, fascinating facts as well about heart disease. He talks about heart disease again and again in this book. He says, people say that the most common reasons for heart disease are smoking, obesity, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol. But more than 50% of people who suffer from heart disease don't have any of these symptoms. And in his opinion, 8 out of 10 people who have these symptoms never suffer a heart attack. So he comes to the conclusion that what may cause heart disease, there may be other genuine reasons, like being predisposed because of our ethnic background or genetic reasons and other reasons like that. But if these were not factors and reasons, he says the reason to blame for that heart disease is the mind and not the heart. He says, in our pursuit of wanting to live long, we are so obsessed. Now, in some ways, it's not very good to read the book, because he says we are so obsessed about exercising and eating healthy that we make our life so miserable with that. We end up living a long, miserable life instead of a half-decent, happy life. And he says that misery and unhappiness and that abuse of the heart by the mind is what kills us. Some very interesting research, and he approaches it obviously from a scientific point of view that we cannot obviously go into. But I'm going to share a little bit tomorrow when he talks about how when they check your heart with ECGs and so on, and he talks about the heartbeat and in relation to the universe. There's some fascinating information. But I want to share with you something that he talks about here that he calls stonewalling. And he basically is talking about how when we communicate as human beings, we need to communicate from heart to heart, not from the mind to the mind, or from the mind to the heart, or from the heart to the mind. And he believes that all causes of conflict, because he's a psychologist as well, he says all causes of conflict is because we mix the mind with the heart as opposed to using the heart with the heart. And he comes up with these terms like flooding the heart with negative energy and then stonewalling to stop the flooding. And then because of this abuse of the heart, from a physiological point of view, he is obviously not going to say spiritual point of view, it leads to physical forms of illnesses. Now he gives an example that I'll share with you very quickly. He says that a physio-psychological response called flooding occurs in partners in relationships who are critical of each other when they stonewall and refuse to engage emotionally. Flooding is primarily the rapid increase in the heart rate. Depending on the body size, a man's heart beats at rest at about 70 beats per minute, where a woman's heart beats about 82 beats per minute. Now, flooding occurs when the heart rate increases about 10 beats per minute. Some people who are more temperamental may have a more highly reactive heart. Now he gives an example. He says women tend to be better in expressing emotion. And when they are in a relationship with a man, like with their husband, and they have an issue that they want to complain about, they will speak from the heart. In most relationships, because she can relate more to the heart and she is more heart-focused, she complains about a problem that she feels in her heart. But her spouse does not sense this. The man who usually has his heart less in the relationship, he tries to use his brain to figure out the substance of the problem and how it might immediately be fixed. Because men are more I shouldn't say simple, but black and white. They are more mathematical in how they solve problems. So when the wife says, I have a headache, I'm like, why don't you take a Panadol? Because in their mind, it's black and white. Problem, solve. Problem, solve. Problem, solve. You have a headache? You have a Panadol. She knows she can take a Panadol. There's a different reason why she's saying that. And that is where men sometimes fail. Okay. Now, because of his protective and selfish brain, he personalizes the complaint as its own failure. And since the problem was detected by the woman's heart, and the man is trying to solve it with his brain, many relationship problems may be due to speaking in two different codes. The man's brain feels its heart starting to flood and tells him to withdraw. Now his heart rate begins to beat faster. And there is what he calls flooding. His heart rate begins to beat faster. When that happens, the brain tells him it is time to withdraw. So the mind begins saying, go golfing, go watch a ball game, cut the grass, do anything but just get away from this hassle for a while. So he's now withdrawing. When the man withdraws or intellectualizes a complaint, the woman goes from emotional disappointment to intellectual disgust and becomes critical. Failing to connect from heart to heart, now she uses her brain more than her heart and tries to find her partner's weak point in order to make her emotional point. She either exaggerates the problem, or she begins to sulk and she stops talking to him. Or she initiates a subtle emotional vendetta intended to teach her partner a lesson the hard way. And then this fellow has done research from a cardiovascular point of view. He says when the man's heart floods, his brain detects a vague sense of dread, and he stonewalls or tries to stop that flooding. When he blocks that, he deflects the energy from that back to her. And when he stonewalls the negative energy, it bounces back to her, and it bounces off, and she stonewalls, and then it bounces off from her wall. And as a result of that, there is a toxic energy that rebounds back to her heart, and now she begins to flood in her heart. When the man's heart floods, he stonewalls and tries to block off or send the disruptive energy away in an attempt to maintain his own cardiac coherence. When a woman's heart floods, she tends to send the disruptive energy inside, which weakens her immune system. As a result, she now begins to experience various infections, allergies, headaches, and so on and so forth. Some fascinating research. And tomorrow, inshallah, I'll explain to you a little bit from this again when he talks about this energy, so we understand what he means by this energy. But he is now talking as a scientist, and he is connecting this idea that when we don't understand that our heart is our most precious possession, and when we lose the ability to communicate from heart to heart, and we let the mind become the real me, and we start disrupting communication, then relationships break down. And not only do they break down at an emotional and psychological and social level, but they become so toxic that they then cause a weakness in the immune system, which then cause the person to fall ill more easily. And this is just one example. I have seen a very similar idea from other psychologists as well. So there is some very interesting material that we want to see here. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now I am coming towards a conclusion, but there is one or two things that I want to mention as well that will wrap up the subject very well tonight. He says that when a person dies, there is some information that is embedded in the heart that never disappears. And that ties very well to the Islamic idea that even when a person dies, Allah can resurrect him because there is a part of the human being that is indestructible. And he has given numerous examples where a person receives a transplant of a heart and changes completely and behaves like a different person. And very often the characteristics in this person is similar to that of the person whose heart he received. There are some examples in this book that I cannot even give you from the mimbar. Examples of women who receive a heart from another woman of a very loose character, and their spouses complain of how they say physically, this is my wife, but I cannot understand or relate to her anymore. She's become a different person altogether. He gives one example. He says there was an 8-year-old girl who received a heart transplant from a 10-year-old girl who was murdered. And she would wake up every night and scream and talk about the murderer. Her mother took her to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist, and he says, this doctor himself, Dr. Paul Pearsall, he says he was attending an international conference in Houston, Texas, where there were psychologists and psychiatrists from all over the world. And this psychiatrist was speaking about this at this international conference in Texas, and was narrating this personally, that he or she received this 8-year-old as a patient. I think it was a she. She says, at some point I could not deny that the little girl was saying something that was important. And they had to call the police. And she identified the murderer of the girl whose heart she had received. And the psychiatrist says she was so accurate in the description that when the murderer confessed, there was 100% match on where the murder occurred, what time it occurred, what weapon was used, what dress the murderer was wearing, what the murderer said to the 10-year-old girl when he murdered her. The last words were also embedded in her heart. When she would wake up in the night, she would utter the same words. And he gives examples after examples. He says this will change how scientists and doctors view the heart. So now, like I said, science is primitive. Islam has been saying all this time, the heart is where you got to look. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. The heart is what does tadabbur. The heart holds the truth. Don't lose your heart. The heart is the arsh of Rahman. Science has been saying, no, it's the mind. No, it's the mind. Now scientists themselves are writing and saying, perhaps it is the heart, because we are seeing that when the person dies and the brain cells die, there is nothing we can retrieve from the brain. But if we transplant the heart to another person, the person changes. And now he's expressing a concern that scientists are now reaching a point where they're talking of transplanting animals' hearts to human beings. For example, they're experimenting now with using pig implants and pig hearts on human beings. And he says, a famous cardiologist says, you don't need to worry, you're not going to start oinking from the first day. But we don't know what impact it will have on a human's mind when they start receiving the hearts of animals. And Islam has been saying this in hadith, that unless tawheed enters a person's heart, when they die, the shock of death, the shock of saying Malakul Maut is so severe, they forget La ilaha illallah. It erases from their mind completely. That is why we say to the person who is dead, he has been a Muslim 60, 70, 80 years, he is dead, we shake him. Isma, ifham, isma, ifham. When these Malakul Maut, when Munkar and Nakir come to you and they ask you, Man Rabbuk, Man Imamuk, what is your book? Then tell them, Allah is my Lord. Why do you have to tell them? Because if it hasn't entered the heart, it vanishes. The mind is like RAM. The heart is the hard disk. The challenge is that I read religious books. I give lectures. I talk. You listen. We sit. We gather. We have tafsir classes. We have discussions. Is it going beyond the mind into the heart? If it's not penetrating the heart, that is why when we memorize something very well, what do we say? We say he learned it by heart, not by mind. If you learn the Quran by heart, it will stay with you even beyond death. But if you learn Quran with the mind, you will forget it. If the heart does not change, if the heart is not affected, then that La ilaha illallah will fail us at the time of dying. There was a man who was very religious and very pious, and I'm narrating this very quickly. When he was dying, they were saying to him, say La ilaha illallah. He was saying no. Say La ilaha illallah. He was refusing. After he died, they found out that the doctors had recommended to him to take some medicine which had alcohol in it, or some wine, and they told him to take a small cup of wine every day for his health, because it is good for the heart. So because he was concerned about his physical and medical well-being, he was drinking wine. The effect of that is that it erased La ilaha illallah from his heart. Because everything you eat and everything you drink, as we shall see, goes into your blood. And it is your heart that pumps the blood. And this is where we will see the connection between the spiritual heart and the physical heart. There was an anecdote I narrated once here as well, that there was a man who used to have a parrot. It sounds funny, but it drives the point home. He had a parrot who was trained to say La ilaha illallah. And people would come from far and wide to listen to this parrot. Come and listen to this parrot. It says La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah. Everybody goes, subhanallah, he's got a parrot that says La ilaha illallah. How many of us are like the parrots? Huh? One day, the neighbor's cat came into the house and ate the parrot. Decided, I'm going to have this for dinner. And the parrot was screeching and screaming, and it basically killed the parrot. After that, there was a mourning period, and people were coming to offer their condolences for the parrot. And the man was crying profusely. So people said to him, Baba, it was a parrot. Should you really be crying so much? He said, I'm not crying because the parrot died. I'm crying because all its life it said La ilaha illallah. But when it was dying, it was screeching and screaming and not saying La ilaha illallah. So there was a wise man sitting there. He said, my friend, that is because La ilaha illallah was on its beak. In its heart, there was screeching and screaming. It wasn't in its heart. So when it was dying, what was in the heart was coming out. So the point here is that if La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, Ahlul Bayt, Fadail, Quran, if it is in the mind only, then it is like in the beak of the parrot. When we die, that which is in the heart that we hide from people, the sinful thoughts, the things we do, the activities that we do not repent from, that only we know and Allah knows, those are the things that will come out. Because the heart is what remains. And the bond between the soul and the body, as we shall see, it is most tight on the heart, and it is the last to separate. So the idea is to penetrate the heart. And that then ties into our subject of in search of a weeping heart. That this is our most prized possession. This is what we want to prepare and keep ready for the Day of Judgment, inshallah. So we stop here for tonight, inshallah, and then we will continue. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In our discussion concerning the Masa'ib of Ali Muhammad and the tragedy after Karbala and the suffering of the women of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam that we have been talking about and remembering and paying our respects to them. Last night we said that after Karbala, the army of Ibn Ziyad shackled and chained Imam Sajjad alayhi salam and tied the women with ropes. And they put them on camels without saddles and brought them to Kufa. All the women were tied at their hands, but little Sakina was tied on her neck because she was too short. And we are told as well that when she came to Sham, to the Darbar of Yazid, Yazid had actually said to her that, "Oh Sakina, why do you always shift your weights from one side to the other?" And Sakina had cried and said, "It is because I am young. Your people tied the hands of the women, but they tied my neck with the same rope. So every time a woman sits or stands or moves, it tugs and pulls at my neck." The women were brought first to Kufa, to the Darbar of Ibn Ziyad. And this was around the 13th of Muharram. Ibn Ziyad wrote a letter to Yazid saying, "Hussein has been killed, and I have his women folk and his son." Yazid wrote back and said, "Send the head of Hussein and his women folk to Sham." This was the biggest mistake that Yazid did, which destroyed his kingdom, because he underestimated Zainab alayhi salam. He did not understand the power that this daughter of Ali held. First, she was the daughter of Ali and Fatima, and then as a woman, she had a power that no man had before her. The Prophet did not destroy Abu Sufyan, and under duress, he changed and pretended to be a Muslim. Imam Ali alayhi salam could not go to Sham and kill Muawiyah. Imam Hassan as well was not able to kill Muawiyah. Imam Hussein fought against Yazid, but he did not penetrate Sham. And the reason for that is because as men, if they would have taken an army and charged into Sham, then history would have written that this was an assassination. This was a takeover. This was an attempt to get power and khilafat. But now that Zainab is going as a prisoner, by Allah, she overturned Sham upside down. And she shook the kingdom of Yazid. And tomorrow, inshallah, we will talk about the Darbar of Sham. But for tonight, we simply narrate an incident that when the women and Imam Sajjad were brought to Sham, much after the incident of Karbala, when somebody asked Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, Yabna Rasulillah, where did you suffer the most? He said, Ash-Sham, Ash-Sham, Ash-Sham. Because in Sham, I was made to stand like a slave whose master is lost and who had no helper to help him. They brought the Ahlul Bayt outside. You have seen the Darbar of Yazid and the Umayyad mosque. And they kept them standing outside for hours and hours while Yazid drank wine and played with chess. And we are told that as the women waited there, somebody came to the wife of Yazid, who was called Hind bin Abdullah bin Amir. She was in the house of Imam Ali alayhi salam at one point after her father was killed. But after Imam Ali's shahadat, when Muawiyah took over Khilafat, he had her brought to Damascus and married her to Yazid. But in her heart, she was a lover of the Ahlul Bayt. She did not know that Hussein had been killed and that the women had been brought. And we are told that somebody came to Hind and said to her, because she was now the queen of Damascus, and said to her that there are some women that have been brought from a strange land as prisoners. And we are told that Hind decided to dress up and go out and see who they are. And she put on the best of her garments, and she put on the best of her perfumes, and she wore the best of her jewelry, and she sat on a chair and she was carried by slaves and brought out to the caravan where these women were standing. And as soon as they came, Zainab alayhi salam saw her. She turned to Kulthum and said, "Oh Kulthum, do you realize who this woman is coming to us on this chair?" And Kulthum says to Zainab, "Who is this lady?" He says, "This is our maid, Hind." And Kulthum and Zainab alayhi salam lower their head and cover their faces with their hair. When Hind comes to them, she does salam to them. She says to them, "Why is your head lowered? From which city do you come? Where have you been brought from?" Zainab alayhi salam says, "We are from Bilad of Medina." As soon as Hind hears Medina, she comes down from the chair. She comes down from her pedestal. She comes down from where she is sitting. Zainab alayhi salam says to her, "Oh Hind, why have you come down from where you are sitting?" She says, "Ta'adhiman liman sakan al-Madina," out of respect and honor for one who lives in Medina. Zainab says to her, "What have you got to do with Medina?" Hind says, "I want to ask you about one family from Medina." "Which family do you want to know about in Medina?" He says, "Tell me about the family of Ali ibn Abi Talib." He says, "What do you want to know about Ali ibn Abi Talib's family?" And Hind says to Zainab, "I want to know about my master Hussein. I want to know about my Sayyida Zainab. I want to know about my Sayyida Kulthum. I want to know the news of what has happened to them." Zainab uncovers her face and says, "Oh Hind, you have not recognized us. If you are asking about Zainab, in sa'alti an Zainab fa ana Zainab bint Ali." If you ask about Zainab, then I am Zainab bint Ali. Wa in sa'alti an Kulthum fa hadhihi Kulthum. If you want to know where is Kulthum, then this is Kulthum. If you ask about Hussein, his head is on a tray in front of your husband Yazid. If you ask about Abbas, Abbas's head is on a spear. Hind cannot believe what she is seeing. She takes a stone from the ground and hits herself until she bleeds. She tears her clothes and goes before Yazid. "Oh Yazid, have you no shame that you parade the head of Hussein in Damascus? Oh Yazid, how could you do this to the grandson of the Prophet?" Yazid is ashamed to see his wife in torn clothes. He descends from his pulpit and takes his abba and covers her. Hind cries out and says, "Oh Yazid, how shameless you are. You cover your wife, but you leave the daughters of the Prophet uncovered like this." ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. إلهي بحق محمد وأنت المحمود وبحق علي وأنت الأعلى وبحق فاطمة وأنت فاطر السماوات والأرض وبحق حسن وأنت المحسن وبحق الحسين وأنت قديم الإحسان وبحق 9 من ذرية الحسين. يا الله يا الله يا الله يا الله. Oh Allah, we ask you بحق Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad to forgive our sins this night. Oh Allah, بحق Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, we ask you to accept our gathering here tonight. بحق Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, oh Allah, we ask you for shifa of those who are ill and maghfirah for those who have passed away. Ilahi bihaqi Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, we ask you to hasten the appearance of our Imam and make us amongst his ashab and ansar. Ilahi ameen. If I can ask you to recite a Fatiha for all our Shia brothers and sisters who have been killed in Iraq today while they have been going for the ziyarat of Imam Hussein. May Allah bless them and grant them a place in Jannah, and may Allah destroy their enemies and our enemies. إلهي بحق محمد وآل محمد آمين يا رب العالمين. لأرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات سورة المباركة الفاتحة.